Hi there, AP Psych friends. We are now in Unit 4, Sensation and Perception. This is Video 1, and we are just going to refer to Part 1 as Sensation and Perception Basics. So before we head into the material, take a look at the image on your screen and tell me what it is that you see. Given proper eye and brain functioning, we all see the exact same thing. It's our interpretation of what this is a picture of that may vary. And so from this point forward, we have to now speak as psychologists would speak and not ask the question, what do you see, but what you perceive. And so psychologists, specific groups of psychologists, enjoy studying this process of how does our body take information in from the environment and what processes occur for individuals to assign interpretation to the sensory information. And so that's what Unit 4 is all about. Okay, so let's start with sensation and the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation is the process of taking information in from the environment using one of our senses. And Unit 4 is going to, in due time, cover all of these, from vision through the sense of touch and everything in between. Perception is the psychological process of organizing and interpreting sensory information. A note from your textbook reading, if you haven't done that. We perceive the world not exactly as it is, but as it is useful for us to perceive it. So keep that in mind as we go through this unit. Psychophysics is going to be a career choice or a subcategory of psychology that focuses on the relationship between physical characteristics of stimuli and the psychological experience that these stimuli produce. So if that is two of your favorite subject areas, perhaps you would want to explore that as a possible future career. Alright, so we are going to now get into the physical properties of sensation. What is occurring when information comes in from our senses? First, we can start with, no matter what sense we're talking about, we can talk about an accessory structure. And that's going to be a body part that modifies the stimulus detected by our senses. And so when we talk about the eye, we can actually talk about the cornea. When we talk about the ear, we'll actually talk about the shape of your ear as actually being the accessory structure that modifies sound waves and routes them into your ear canal. And so all of our senses, we can talk about accessory structures. The next thing that we can talk about in the physical process is something known as transduction. Transduction is just the process of converting the energy into neural activity. Related to this is what's known as coding. That's just what we call translating the physical property of a stimulus into a pattern of neural activity that can identify those properties. So like looking at a chair, for example, requires the information to be converted to neural activity that's sent to the part of the brain that recognizes chairs as an object. And so coding will be something that we discuss a little bit later as it pertains to our interpretation of things. But know that the process of converting energy into neural activity is called transduction. A great example of that would be if you've ever rubbed your eyes. When you rub your eyes, you sometimes get these light sensations behind your eyelid. The reason being is that you are applying pressure to your eyes, but the little cells in your eyes only understand light energy, and so they are going to send any stimulation as a neural impulse that gets translated by the brain as light. Your sensory receptors are going to be the special cells that detect the energy. And so sensory receptors are actually similar to neurons because they're the ones that respond to the energy, and they're the ones that start the action potential, which sends neurotransmitters to the neurons. But sensory receptors don't have dendrites or axons, and so we'll when we talk about each of the senses, we can specifically talk about the sensory receptors. So in the case of the Unit 2 free response. Or sorry, Unit 3 free response. Those of you that chose the question about like stubbing your toe, right? That's the component that made it a little harder for you to understand that kind of free-formed question, and that a sensory receptor is actually the thing in your skin that recognizes that your toe has been stubbed and generates the action potential needed for those neurons to send the message to the spinal cord and brain. So we'll get into that as we talk about each of the senses. Then, of course, you already know from Unit 3, neurons are going to be the nerve cells that send the information to the brain from the senses. Remember, these are sensory neurons. That's why we call them that. And also remember from Unit 3 that all of our senses except smell are first routed to the sensory switchboard known as the thalamus. Related to this, the doctrine of specific nerve energy. That's just a rule that says stimulation of a particular sensory nerve is going to generate a code for that sense, regardless of how the stimulation takes place. And so the example I had given earlier for transduction of putting gentle pressure on your eyes and seeing light spots is an example of the doctrine of specific nerve energies. Okay, some more sensation basics. Let's talk about the basic principles behind this information. We can talk about the difference between bottom-up processing and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing means that we're going to begin with sensory receptors, and it's going to work its way up to the brain where we integrate the info there. So the first picture that we showed at the beginning of this video would be a great example of bottom-up processing. Unless you'd seen that in some optical illusion book or on a website, you hadn't seen that before, and so you had to just take that information in, and then your brain worked hard using those association areas in the various cortices to try to figure out what it was. Top-down processing is going to be guided by higher level mental processes, and you're going to construct your interpretation based on previous experience and expectations. So bottom and top kind of explain why these concepts of sensation and perception are really hard to separate. It's why in everyday language we ask the question, what do you see in this picture of black and white spots versus what do you perceive, right? The more experience you have with the world, the more differently you begin to sense the world. And so both of them are going to work in tandem concerning sensation and perception. Your senses are amazing if you refer back to what you learned in Unit 3 about the brain's plasticity. Right? Our senses do have an ability to adapt. And even without injury, our senses are still adapting in that they get tired of sending the same information to the brain. And so your eyes, as you look at your screen right now or look down to your paper as you take notes, are actually moving back and forth ever so slightly to give the brain a slightly different visual image each time. If this didn't happen, good grief, the PowerPoint before your very eyes would disappear, right? You'd cease to see it because your eyes would get tired of sending the same information to your brain. And so we'll do some practice with sensory adaptation in class. We also know that people tend to focus their conscious awareness on particular things. And so, focusing intently on this lecture may mean that you are tuning out other things that are occurring, such as, other sounds in the room that you're in right now, or the temperature of that room, or how hungry or thirsty you are. All sorts of things can kind of be tuned out as a result of only paying attention to the things that your brain deems important. The reverse, selective inattention, would mean that you fail to notice things. Okay, and so when we talk about inattentional blindness, we're talking about the failing to see a visible object because your attention's directed elsewhere. Why it's not good to text and drive at the same time is a good example of that. And change blindness is failing to notice change in the environment because your attention is elsewhere. And so we will look at some examples of those two things in class. Okay, notes break. Take a look here. Can you read this? Spell check. Why didn't I use it? I don't need to, right? You can read it just fine. So how can you do that? Your brain is relying on past perceptual experiences, which is something you learned on the previous slide. That's right, top-down processing. Okay, so because you know how to read and you've read for many years now, you can rely on your previous experiences to be able to figure out what this very messy paragraph is saying. So good job. Okay, our last slide. We're still talking about our basic principles of sensation. I just thought we needed a little break there. Okay, thresholds or supraliminal stimuli. Have you heard the word subliminal, but you've probably never heard the word supraliminal. It's the opposite, right? The stuff we can detect with our senses is called supraliminal. The stuff that is unavailable to our awareness is subliminal. We'll get there in just a second. But let's talk about some things underneath thresholds. Absolute threshold is going to be the smallest amount of stimulus that can be detected by our senses 50% of the time is the revision, right? Getting things from our senses is not an all or nothing thing. I mean, just think back to change blindness and inattentional blindness that we just discussed. And so what's the quietest sound that your ears can detect? What's the furthest away that your eyes can detect a light source? Those sorts of things. And so we'll do some examples of those in class as well. Signal detection theory is just going to talk about the theory that predicts how we detect the presence of a stimulus. And so signal detection theory kind of assumes that there's no single absolute threshold. And so detection of things just depends on our experiences and our moods and things of that nature. All right, and so signal detection could be based on sensitivity, right? Your ability to detect the strength of a signal. Good vision versus bad vision would be an example of your sensitivity. The amount of background noise, both internal, inside your head, or if you're at a large party, probably difficult to study or focus on something as a result of the sensitivity being decreased. And response criterion is just your willingness to respond to criterion. So expecting a stimulus makes it easier to detect. An example of this is sometimes companies that use assembly line production will purposely every so often put a bad product out on the assembly line just to make sure that inspectors, that their employees are staying on guard, are staying on their toes. Because if for days and days and days you have yet to see a defective product, you may kind of begin to gloss over those things because you're bored. Okay, one other thing related to thresholds is the difference threshold, or sometimes referred to as the just noticeable difference. That's what JND is in parentheses. Okay, and this is related to the minimum amount of change that can be detected between two stimuli 50% of the time. We have an individual whose last name was Faber, who came up with Faber's law, and this is to be perceived as different. Two stimuli must differ by a constant percentage rather than a specific amount. So quarters in an envelope, we'll use that as our example. Can you detect which envelope has more quarters in it? Probably if you're holding them, but to put those envelopes like down inside your shoes, you probably couldn't tell anymore, right? And so you know, the situation is going to depend on things, and you know, the sensory input has to differ pretty significantly for people to actually notice a difference. Okay, and know that unfortunately as we age, we kind of become less sensitive to changes in stimuli. And now for the fun, right? Subliminal stimulation, something that's below our absolute threshold for conscious awareness. Can we detect those things? Technically, we can, since subliminal is really related to the definition we gave of absolute threshold, and that some 50% of the time we might not understand stuff, but it doesn't probably have a lasting effect in making people do things. So more examples to come in class. Thanks for listening.